So for those of you who don't know me, once again, Caitlin Southwick, and before I was a sustainability person, I was an art conservator. These are pictures of me on the island of Rapa Nui working on the Moai statues. And as you can see, we are spraying the Moai statues and then wrapping them from head to mid-thigh, I suppose, in plastic. As a conservator, I loved my job. I knew that what I was doing was really important, but for some reason, it just wasn't quite sitting right with me. And what we're going to do today is start unpacking a little bit why I was feeling like that, and then what the solutions are. So one of the important things we have to unpack here is sustainability as a word. So I would love it if you guys wouldn't mind sharing just in the chat, or if you're feeling super brave, feel free to share it out loud. But what does the word sustainability mean to you? So when I say sustainability, what does that mean? And once again, feel free to just type that in the chat if you'd like. I'm going to pull the chat up, see if anyone is brave enough to respond to that. So what does sustainability mean to you? I'm going to give you guys a second to think about that. There we go. Okay. Well, while thinking about it, I'll give you some responses that I've received in the past. Oh, here we go. Perfect. Thank you. So something that has duration and is viable. Thank you. Perfect. Practices that are respectful and considerate of environment and people. Absolutely. Thank you, Rania. Responsibility. Thank you, Lorena. Absolutely. Treading lightly across the earth, minimizing use of resources, making the most of what we have. A floating capacity. Interesting, Nelson. Living, working, doing things in a way that won't impact the environment negatively. To me, it's about minimalism and critical thinking. I love that. Those are all wonderful answers. And thank you again to everyone for sharing. That's really fantastic. As we can see, sustainability means different things to different people. And that's one of the nuances, maybe something a little bit confusing, but also one of the really exciting things about sustainability. Bart said, make sure that things are preserved in a way that future generations can benefit from the same things as we do now. Absolutely. Thank you for that. So as I mentioned, when I talk to people about sustainability, we get a lot of different responses. Some people say it's making positive change. Some people say it's being environmentally responsible. We saw some of that. Some people said it's being socially responsible. We also saw some of that in our answers. And a lot of times people say that sustainability is something that's important for the future. But what we're going to learn about today is that sustainability is actually important for now, and something that not only applies to our future, but applies to our day-to-day lives today. So the formal definitions of sustainability was first used in 1972 at the Club of Rome, when it was described as a, quote, state of global equilibrium. Today, the most commonly used definition of sustainability comes from the Brundtland Report 15 years later, which describes sustainability as something that, quote, meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So Bart, very similar to your definition. And this is really just, once again, a framework for starting to think about what this topic means. As I promised, we're going to delve into, very briefly, an overview of the frameworks of sustainability from an international perspective. But what I would really like for you all to get out of our discussion today is more about what sustainability means to you. So the most commonly used international frameworks for sustainability tend to be the Sustainable Development Goals. And those were taken from what's called Agenda 2030. So Agenda 2030 is actually the declaration behind the Sustainable Development Goals. And a lot of people don't know about Agenda 2030, the proclamation itself, but are familiar with the SDGs, which is fantastic. The link is right here. I'm obviously happy to share the slides, but basically the Agenda 2030 is based on these 5 principles of people, planet, partnership, peace, and prosperity. And then the idea is that in order to create this sustainable future, we have to achieve these goals, which of which there are 17. So that's how the Sustainable Development Goals relates to this idea of a sustainable future. They're basically the blueprint for what we want our future to look like. So this is the idea behind Agenda 2030. And as I mentioned, this was written in 2015, and we'll go into the lineage in just a moment. The other accord that you might be familiar with that came out in the same year was the Paris Agreement. And of course, this is the International Treaty on Climate Change. And one of the things that's important to understand about the Paris Agreement is that what it's really trying to do is limit our global temperature increase to below 2 degrees, and ideally below 1.5 degrees. And why we want to do this is basically because we would like to maintain this beautiful planet we live on as habitable for our species. The latest IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, they issue annual reports, and their latest reports have said that in order to accomplish this, in order to meet the Paris Agreement's requirements of maintaining below 1.5 degrees, we have to halve our carbon emissions by 2030. Now, remember this because this comes into play and is a very important aspect when we start talking about net zero versus carbon zero. So our goal is to halve our emissions by 2030. All right. Broader overview of the history of sustainability. Once again, different contexts here. So if we're looking at sustainability, it really didn't start at the Club of Rome in 1972. It started a long time before that, in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, this declaration is still incredibly important today, and I think a lot of people forget about it, but this was basically the foundation for social sustainability. Then, of course, we came to the more formal definition at the Club of Rome, the Brundtland Report, and then we started getting more concrete with the foundations with Agenda 21 and the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first real discussion of climate change. And then we went into the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, which then turned into Agenda 2030, the SDGs, in 2015 with the addition of the Paris Agreement. So this is basically the timeline of how sustainability is developed. And what's also really important to understand is that sustainability is not synonymous with climate change. Sustainability is this larger web, which we're going to pick apart a little bit later, but it's usually comprised of 3 pillars: social, environmental, and economic. A lot of people say that culture is the 4th pillar. Personally, I think culture is actually that pedestal that everything is standing on, but this is the internationally accepted framework. So, as I mentioned, when I was doing my art conservation work, I really loved what I was doing. But as I said, I was having a hard time aligning my day job with my moral and ethical compass. And it wasn't until my good friend Henry McGee gave me his definition of sustainability that it hit. Because I knew what I was doing was wonderful, but the way that I was doing it was damaging, not only to the environment, but to myself and also to other people. Because I was using toxic materials, I was consuming massive amounts of energy, and I was also doing this in a way that didn't necessarily fulfill my own economic needs. So Henry describes sustainability as doing good without doing harm. And that completely hit home for me because I knew that what I was doing was a good thing, but the way I was doing it was harmful. So I wanted to see if I could find a way to still fulfill my goals and requirements as an art conservator, but in a way that took into account all of these different components of sustainability: people, planet, prosperity, but also environment, social, economic, looking at the whole picture. So when we start talking about sustainability, I think one of the things that's challenging about it is we don't really know what it looks like. If you joined me for the Europeana annual conference last year, then you'll have seen this picture before. But just a reminder, sustainability is something that if we don't know what it looks like, it can be really challenging to figure out how to get there. And I always compare this to doing a jigsaw puzzle upside down. If you're handed a jigsaw puzzle, then you know what the picture looks like, and you've been taught how to put it together. You match the colors. But if you flip it upside down, then all of a sudden this looks impossible because how are you supposed to put this together? We haven't been taught to do this, and there's no picture we're working towards. So, don't even bother. But if we start looking at things a little bit differently, if we start picking out the shapes or the patterns instead of the colors, well, of course, we're going to start with the framework because that's the easiest thing. And all of a sudden we have that. And then we can start aligning our pieces in a different way than we would have before. Before you know it, you can actually start putting pieces together and seeing how they connect. And then you have something that makes sense. Now we know what the picture looks like, but we know how to get there. And that's really important. It's understanding what these tools are. And of course, painting the picture is something I'm very passionate about, but that's still a work in progress. And that's another conversation. All right. So we know sustainability is important. And what I would like to also really stress today is that sustainability is not just important on a global scale for people, but it's really important for us as cultural professionals. Now, once again, I'm coming from a conservation background, so this is slightly tainted to my context. But if we start thinking about sustainability for cultural contexts, climate change is no longer a looming threat. It's something that's happening right now, and it's directly affecting and damaging our cultural heritage, from coastal erosion threatening built heritage to flooding all over Europe and other parts of, and fires in other parts of the world causing evacuations and destruction of our collections. It's no longer something that is apart from us in terms of that way. It is now something that is a part of us in terms of being inherent in what we do. And of course, one of the other problems we have is that as a cultural sector, we don't really know what our role is in all of this in terms of prevention or in terms of how much we're contributing. When we start talking about things like carbon footprints, like that's, the pharmaceutical company or the fossil fuel company, like how does that relate to us? But if we actually start doing some measurements, which I'm very grateful to say that this is now a hot trend, and we'll delve into this a little bit more later. If we're looking at what our actual impact is, we have to start being realistic about some numbers. So this is a study that was done at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2008. I have to say that they've done a lot of upgrades since then. This is no longer the case. But just to give you a little bit of context, if we don't know, then it's hard to think about how important it is for us to make changes. So this is an energy audit, and basically this looks at what percentage of energy consumption of an entire building, and then calculates it in terms of carbon emissions. So if you're looking at the pink piece of the pie, that is the amount, 29% of energy at the Kensington building of the V&A Museum that the lighting is responsible for. So this is one building, one museum, and just the lights. And that produces over 1,500 tons of carbon emissions every year. Now, you already can see the numbers here, but just to put this into context, 1,500 tons of carbon emissions is over 300 passenger vehicles driven for a year. That is enough carbon to power 256 homes electricity for an entire year. And it's nearly 2 million pounds of coal burned. And if we're thinking that the lighting at one museum could also power over 250 homes for a year, and we're looking at the energy crisis that we're in right now, it may be very difficult for us to justify keeping those lights on. So this is why it's really important. Another example, an exhibition. So this is an example of an exhibition that was conducted in Los Angeles. They did a carbon calculation, 214.5 tons. What does that mean? 46 cars. Over 237,000 pounds of coal was burned. And almost 42 homes could be powered by the electricity from one exhibition at one museum. Temporary exhibition, mind you. And it would take 254 acres of forest to be able to sequester that much carbon. So if we're looking at this, we might actually start thinking that our piece of the pie is a little bit bigger than we originally thought. This is why it's so important for us to understand what our impact is, but even more important for us to understand that we all have a role to play, that this is the responsibility of every one of us to be part of these conversations and part of the solutions, no matter how small we think we are. Another example, just putting it in context of digital, NFTs. One project at the British Museum used enough carbon to power a US home for 57 years. So once again, context. All right. Now we've looked at a little bit of how this impacts the environment, but how does this impact our society? And if you've met me before, you know how passionately I believe that culture is the solution to all of our sustainability needs, because we are the ones who actually connect with people on an emotional and personal level. And this is really imperative when we're looking at social sustainability, because we have to think about what histories are we telling. We shape our society through our narratives and through our collections. So if we're telling history from one side of the story, then we may be accidentally promoting structural racism. If we're not being clear and transparent about where our collections are coming from and how we got them, we may be part of a colonial narrative. If we're not making our collections accessible to everyone, then we're being exclusive. So these are some of the really hard questions we have to start asking ourselves. What is the purpose of collections care? Is it just about the objects, or is it also about the societies that are interacting with them and the societies where they came from and those relationships between those societies? So these are some of the tough questions that as institutions and as cultural professionals, we really have to start thinking about. I wanted to take just a little bit of time, as I promised, to go through the SDGs. I know that a lot of you are quite familiar with these and have been using them, but I'm hoping that we can unpack them a little bit more to also make sure we're all on the same page, but also to see how some of these that we may not understand how they apply to us do apply to us. And then also looking at how we can use the SDGs effectively to further our sustainability causes. So, as we may know, the SDGs were written for policymakers. A lot of these targets are unmanageable, I guess I would say, or not really relevant for us, like target 1.1 by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. And then it went up to $1.90 per day in October of 2015. Let's see, that was how many years ago? So I can't imagine what it's up to today. But anyway, but these are things like that not necessarily applies to us, right? So how do we actually use the SDGs for our benefit? Well, one of the things I want to just be very clear on is that the SDGs have a lot of pros and a lot of cons. So one of the issues we have is that they're outdated. As we just looked at the poverty level line, 2015, like totally irrelevant for today's context and society, especially with inflation, the cost of living crisis, all of these issues. The other things that they're outdated on is that they're not inclusive on Indigenous rights. They have gender limitations in the gender SDG. They only talk about women and men, so they're missing quite a bit. And then also, they should be talking about resilience, and they should be talking about regeneration, which are missing. The pros, though, the reasons that we still do talk about and teach the SDGs is that they are the most internationally recognized framework for sustainability. This is something that when you say SDGs, most people will know what you're talking about. Also, in terms of that, they are a fantastic tool for policy making. So you can connect the SDGs to your policies, and that gives a really strong foundation. And maybe most importantly, in my opinion, is that they are an amazing tool for grants and funding. A lot of foundations, a lot of international and national funding bodies and grant making schemes will align with the SDGs. So this is a great way for you to not only promote your SDG work in terms of how you're communicating about it, but also in terms of how you're receiving funds. So always align your work with the SDGs because they are internationally adopted by, I think it was 192 countries. So this is a really great way for you to say, my project aligns with your goals, and that's why you should fund it. So let's see very quickly here how the SDGs apply to me. Well, as I mentioned, this seems a little bit intangible for us, but I wasn't the only one who thought this. And there's a group in Sweden that looked at the SDGs and thought, okay, these are fantastic for policymakers, but how do we apply this to our own context? How do we apply this as everyday citizens who want to do good? So they created what's called the Good Life Goals. The Good Life Goals are basically a translation of the UN SDGs for individuals on a daily basis. So these are really looking at how you as a average person, you're not average, you guys are all above average, of course, but how everybody can start helping to contribute to and support the SDGs. So for example, SDG 1, which is end poverty, is now called help end poverty, because it's not your responsibility to completely and totally eradicate poverty, but what you can do are things like learn about poverty, educate yourself, buy from companies that pay people fairly, advocate for decent wages and job opportunities. That's really a way that we can start contextualizing how the SDGs fit into our lives. So we were inspired by this and started using this idea to create the culture and heritage goals, which are basically a translation of the SDGs for cultural professionals. So the CHGs, as we call them, are currently have been going under review with various experts from around the world, especially when it comes to accessibility and inclusion. So we've finalizing the final CHGs, and those will be published on our website later this year. I think we're planning on having that live in a couple of months. And then you'll be able to use that as a free open resource and also give us feedback so we can continuously develop them. As I said, the SDGs are a little outdated. We want to make sure that these are always relevant. So I'm not going to go into all of them because I want to get into some more tangible, specific aspects of sustainability. But I did want to just go over a few of these to give us a context about how we can start thinking about the SDGs and applying them to us. So as I mentioned, basically, this was the way that we translated the CHGs, or recreated them. We picked out the targets from the SDGs and then looked at how those related to the cultural sector. So this is just examples of how this basically worked, and then this is what we ended up with. So once again, for example, SDG 1 is end poverty, and CHG 1 is help end poverty. So looking again at how this applies to the cultural sector, ensuring that all employees are paid a decent living wage, also advocating for yourself to earn a decent living wage. Wouldn't that be lovely? I always say that sustainability is challenging because as cultural professionals, we tend to be overworked and underpaid. But if we're not advocating for it, if we're not standing up for ourselves, then it's easy to get walked on. And I think this is one of the most challenging things that we can do, is really show, like, respect our own values and asking for money. And it's hard to do. I'm preaching to the choir on this. I'm not very good at it either, but I think that we can do it if we can do it together and get a little more transparent on it. Other activities that you can do, things like looking at donating extra items from your institution, using your space as a community meeting point if you have one. It's not just about setting limitations for the poverty rate. It's actually about thinking creatively on how you can support your community and yourselves in order to achieve economic sustainability. And this is something that I would love to delve into more, and is a very hot topic in my personal narrative on sustainability, is how can we as the cultural sector be economically sustainable? Because it can be challenging to be socially sustainable or environmentally sustainable if we're not economically sustainable. I'm just reading the comments really quickly. Let's see, as a museologist, as a museum professionals can encourage our colleagues, our museum, to align with the SDGs. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Claudia, for that question. And I'm hoping that by looking at these things individually, you might start getting some ideas. But if you would want to chat a little bit more about that, then I think we'll have some time after we go through a couple of these CHGs to chat about some ideas. And also, of course, at the end, I'm going to wrap up with giving tangible action points that you can do and some communication strategies to help get your colleagues on board, because that's the most important thing. All right. As I said, we're not going to have time to go through every single one of the CHGs, but we'll skip around a little bit. 4, super easy, education. That's what we do. That's literally our jobs. We educate, we engage, we love to support people. So this not only goes with educating our audience, though, it also goes with educating ourselves and providing educational opportunities for continuing and professional development. So sustainability is something that you probably, unless you're a new recent graduate, you probably didn't talk about in your training program. And right now, what you're doing is taking an incredibly important first step in learning about sustainability and educating yourself. And I'm hoping that this will inspire you to continue educating yourself about these topics, because it's really important for us to take that initiative and be able to continuously learn, because sustainability is a continuous journey. In addition, of course, there are more concrete aspects to sustainability. Water actually has 2 SDGs, 6 and 15, 6 and 15. So this one is really about how you use water. So this is about providing free drinking water. I have to say that's one of my favorite sustainability ideas, because it is so tangible, especially in countries in Europe where the drinking water is very good and there's no reason to be selling plastic water bottles. Just a total side note, because I don't get into this later. In terms of plastics and our consumption of plastics, you might be surprised to learn that every week, people, individual, you included, ingest a credit card's worth of microplastics every week. Imagine just having like a plate with a credit card on it and eating that. That's what you do every week, because we have so many microplastics in our system. And the number one place we get microplastics, plastic water bottles. So if you are still a person who is purchasing and drinking from plastic water bottles, I am not here to shame you, but I would love for you to rethink that, because that's not only damaging to the environment in terms of the plastic, but it's very damaging to yourself in terms of your ingesting microplastics. And it's like the number one source by, I think, like 5 times or something. Number 2 is beer, which I'm very upset about, but I don't know. They really have no idea why that is. Fish is like number 5. You think it's number 1. Anyway, tangent. Water, very important resource. One of the things that a lot of people don't know is that in the Netherlands, which you think is full of water, they've been in a drought for the last 20 years. Really interesting to think about that, because you just kind of take advantage or take for granted the fact that there's water out there. So you think that it's just, there's water everywhere. There's an infinite resource. But actually the way that we're treating our water means that we're losing a lot of water, and that is causing an international drought. I was in South Africa when they ran out of water. That was quite an experience. All right, sorry. I could talk about water all day. We'll do a whole section on that. CHG 7, energy. This one really, really important. And I'm going to go into some details about how we can do some energy saving a little bit later. But once again, energy is one of those invisible culprits. It's like water. You just kind of don't think about it. It's just on, it's just there. But of course, energy is one of the biggest producers of carbon emissions, because a lot of our energy comes from burning fossil fuels. So every little bit counts. I mean, if you think about, okay, well, does it really matter if I unplug my cell phone charger because, it's just one cell phone? Said, 7 billion people. Also, of course, there's a lot of things that we can do for looking at our own practices. And a huge one, if you work in an institution or a museum, is climate control. Very unnecessary to be using so much climate control. If you are doing that, please call me. I will help you fix it because it is a really, really easy way for us to reduce up to 82% of our energy consumption by changing our climate control conditions. I will stop talking about climate control. That's like a whole different topic. Activities and work. This one is my favorite one. Well, second, tied for first, we'll say. All right. This is really exciting because this is where we can start seeing what we can do in our day job, not just in terms of preventing and mitigating, but also inviting opportunity. So engaging with conversations about sustainability is one of the most important things we can do. Talk about it. I'm going to say this, I think, 16 times today. The most important thing we can do for sustainability is to talk about it, because then it starts becoming part of our everyday conversation and everyday narrative. If we're not talking about it, it's just something that doesn't exist. So bring it into everyday conversation. Think creatively. This is also one of the reasons I firmly believe that sustainability starts with us as the cultural sector, because we have this unique skill set. We have this way of looking at the world in a creative and exciting way. And if we can use those skills to think of sustainable solutions and to educate and communicate with people about the ideas of sustainability, we're the ones who can paint that picture. We're the ones who can paint the picture on the upside down jigsaw puzzle. And I so firmly believe that we are the ones who have the power to get people excited about making sustainable changes. Because a lot of times sustainability can feel overwhelming or impossible, or that it's compromised. But we can be the ones who can come up with solutions that are win-win-win. We'll talk about that later. CHG 9 is research and development. Once again, something we're really, really good at. A lot of people on this call, I can promise, are researchers, and that's amazing. Dedicate your research to sustainable topics. Every single student I talk to, I say, you have a unique opportunity right now to apply yourself to finding sustainable solutions through your research. And it is incredibly important that we not only look at applying our research, but we look at sharing our research. Sharing is caring, right? And it's so important that we share our information so that others can learn from our progress and that people don't repeat the same mistakes. So research does not have to be a success in terms of you don't have to have results and you don't have to have positive results. Negative results are just as important, and actually even more important, because then once again, people won't make the same mistake. That's how we advance, is learning from each other and sharing. CHG 10 is inclusion. I'm going to give a whole explanation later about why I hate this word. I don't hate this word. That's a very strong word. Why I don't like this word, why I don't think it's the right word to use, but this is the one that is used in SDGs. In fact, you know what? I'm going to update this one to call it belonging, because that's what we really want to do. I'm just making a note of that. Perfect. We'll talk about that later. But basically, what we're looking at when we're talking about this larger concept of inclusion or belonging is making sure that we are providing safe spaces, looking at this idea of colonial narratives. And that does not necessarily mean a colonial institution or a colonial organization, society, colonizing. That is actually about being transparent about your collections. It's about telling history from all sides of the story, whether you're a colonizing or colonized country or not. That does not matter. Decolonization applies to literally everyone. And of course, looking at your own internal practices. What is the diversity in your own organization or institution? What are your policies on this? And we're going to talk more in detail about this idea of equity a little bit later. This is an easy one, CHG 11, because literally SDG 11.4 is to conserve, protect, and house our cultural and natural heritage. That's it, right? We've ticked the box, we're done. We actually are fully sustainable because it's in the SDGs and that's our job. Wonderful, right? But if we go back to Henry's definition of sustainability, we need to not only conserve, protect, and house our cultural and natural heritage, but we need to think about how we're doing it. And actually also why we're doing it. All right, CHG 12, I'm gonna kind of breeze through the last couple of here because I wanna give you guys a little break before we go into the more practical concepts. This is about circularity and consumption. And I'm not going to talk about this right now because I'm going to go into more detail in a little bit later, but I'm just going to tell you that CHG 12 is where we're talking about circular economy. It's where we're talking about life cycle assessment, and it's where we're talking about the 5 R's. So keep that in mind. Climate change, 13. This one obviously is about reducing our carbon emissions. This is about supporting the Paris Agreement. This is about halving our carbon emissions in 7 years. Very, very important aspect for us. Very easy aspect for us, in my personal opinion, because there are so many things that we can do today to start reducing our carbon footprint. There are so many things that we can do as cultural institutions, as creatives, to advocate for climate. And this is not only in terms of our practical actions, like addressing our climate control and reducing our energy consumption and improving our energy efficiency, but it's also about getting creative. It's about communicating about climate. It's about connecting people to nature again. And once again, this is where art and heritage comes into play. This is where history can teach us lessons that are so valuable that we can remember and reuse and think, oh, right. In the 1950s, they didn't have plastic Pepsi everywhere and Coca-Cola. It was all in glass bottles. Maybe we can learn some lessons from the past. And we're, of course, the experts on this. So this is where we get really creative. It's about our communication. It's about our outputs. It's about our education. And it's also about leading by example. And my other tied for #1 favorite is work together. The most important thing that I would like for you to remember is that this is not something you have to do alone. Sustainability is not something that is possible to achieve as an individual. You can obviously make a lot of individual contributions. I should rephrase that because I want to encourage everyone to do things. And it's not that it's impossible to achieve, but that's most easily accessible if you do it together. So let's say it like that. So when we're looking at sustainability, it can feel overwhelming. Maybe we don't feel well educated on the topic. Maybe we feel that there's too much to do. Maybe we just feel that we're already overworked and underpaid and we're tired and please leave me alone. This is where this comes into play because you do not have to be the expert on it. You do not have to know what to do. You just have to be curious and ask. Finding partners, finding allies. This is the key to sustainability. Working together. And of course, the most important aspect of this is recognizing what we're already doing that's great and celebrating that. Sustainability should not feel like a chore. It should not feel like something that you have to do. It should be fun because isn't it fun to save the planet? Like that feels good, right? So celebrate your successes. Don't forget to reward yourself because otherwise it can feel a little bit there's, like you're always trying to keep up with things. But if you take a second to stop and celebrate how far you've already come, you'll realize that we're on a really good path and we're gonna get there. And that hope and that motivation is what keeps driving us. It certainly keeps driving me. Okay. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about this web of sustainability, and then I'll promise I'll give you guys a break before we delve into some of the more detailed topics. As we've looked at, sustainability is not just one thing. It's not climate change. It's not decolonization. It's not durability. It's all of these different things. And that's exciting. It can feel overwhelming, but it's also exciting because there's always an entry point. When we start talking about sustainability, we're not just talking about one aspect, and it's really difficult because sometimes we want to think, okay, well, we just want to concentrate on this. But when we start concentrating on this, then we start seeing how it connects to this and to that and to this other thing. You cannot talk about climate change without talking about the burning of the Amazon, without talking about Indigenous rights, without talking about COVID, without talking about Black Lives Matter, without talking about climate justice. They all connect and they all circle back to each other. And what's really exciting about this and what I like to explain to people is that, this is the way that we connect with each other on sustainability. Because while one aspect of sustainability really matters to me, maybe that's not your entry point, but I can still connect with you on something that matters to you because our topics are interconnected. So if one person is really passionate about climate, and someone else is, they don't really see the integration of climate right now. And they're like, I'm really focused on the fact that, social justice and, maybe they come from a place of extreme poverty and they're really worried about that. Once again, those two things are completely and totally intertwined. So you can still meet people where they are and still have your own passions. So this web is an incredibly important thing to understand. It can look overwhelming, but it's actually our opportunity. I always talk about sustainability as a lens. As we mentioned earlier, if you're looking at a jigsaw puzzle in a different way, you may have to put a different lens on. It's a way of looking at the world. And if you're looking at things by pattern rather than by color, as I mentioned in the analogy of the jigsaw puzzle, that's looking at things in a different way. And once you start educating yourself about sustainability and start learning about the different components, you'll realize that it applies to every single aspect of your life. You'll start seeing it in things and in places that you never expected to see it before. And this is what's so cool is the more you learn, the easier it is to accomplish. And it's just about putting on that lens. It's just about putting on those glasses and seeing the world in a little bit of a different way. So how can we start using this lens? Well, as I've mentioned, and I will mention again, we can talk about it. We can start asking questions. We can normalize sustainability in everyday conversations. I have to say, throughout my journey, I've seen this happen in practice. I remember I always use this as an example when I was a master's student, and people, this is back in 2015, people would tease me about, Caitlin and her sustainability stuff. Oh my God, it's so annoying. Yes, Caitlin, we'll turn the lights off. Yes, we'll start using this. But it started becoming something that was going from me being naggy, and I don't necessarily recommend that, but once again, just talking about it, to people starting to think about it for themselves. And I remember we were having a conversation at a coffee break, and it would drive me crazy because people would always take the cups, the paper cups, which, by the way, are always lined with plastic and cannot be recycled no matter what they tell you. So please use reusable cups. And I remember there was this woman who I was asking her, like, why are you using the paper cups still? Would you mind using the ceramic cups? They're literally right there. There's no difference. And she was like, well, are these really more sustainable? And I said, yes, they are. And she said, well, what about all of the hot water that you have to use to wash these cups? And what about the detergent that you're using to clean them? And all of a sudden we started getting in this conversation. And it was so interesting to me because it wasn't just something that was, dismissed. It was actually started to become a part of our conversation. And then we started applying it to other things, and people started looking at different materials and different items from this lens of what is the impact. And it was amazing to me because this wasn't like, we were art conservators, but all of a sudden it was normal to talk about sustainability in all of these different contexts. So the more you talk about it, the more other people will think about it. And once again, the faster we can go. Sustainability is the future, and it has to be a priority. I think what's really interesting is that, sometimes we might think, especially in the cultural sector, that it's someone else's responsibility or it's a priority for other people, but we have other things we have to take care of, like our heritage and our objects. This is a role for everybody. And it's so important for us to make sure that we are staying relevant by being sustainable. Because if we're not on board with that, we're not going to be around. The other thing that we can start doing is looking at our policies. Sometimes it can be challenging to figure out where to start, but sometimes writing out sustainability really helps. And especially with getting people on board, if you work at an institution, if you have a policy on sustainability, it's really a lot easier to get a project or a program through, because you could say it aligns with our policy, it aligns with our mission. So it's really nice to have things written out. And it's even better if you co-create those. And we'll talk about that more later. And then, of course, it's about leading by example. The most important thing that we can do is show people how it's done, because then it doesn't seem so overwhelming or unachievable. Leading by example is showing that sustainability is easy and that it's fun and that you can do it too. So very important for us to think about how we are exemplifying sustainability in our everyday lives. Okay. Our opportunity, as I've mentioned, and I sometimes think repetition helps, so I'll keep mentioning, we are the cultural sector. We have this incredible opportunity to connect with people in a way that pretty much no one else does. I mean, humans are unfortunately not the most rational creatures. We're emotional. And art and creativity is a way for us to express that and to connect with each other. We know the power of our exhibitions. We know the power of our performances. We know the power of film. We know what kind of an impact this makes on individuals, but also how it shapes society. So imagine if we took that and put a sustainability lens on it. Can you imagine the impact if every movie that you went to had people using reusable water bottles instead of plastic disposable water bottles? Can you imagine the impact if we just normalized that type of behavior through our media? This is what we have an opportunity to do. This is how we not only change our own practices, but we change the world. All right, guys. I've been talking for an hour. I am going to, first of all, check and see if there's anything in the chat. Lots of hearts on Claudia's comments. So thank you again, Claudia, for mentioning that. Bart had a fantastic question. How does the term ethics relate to sustainability when looked at from a cultural heritage point of view, in your opinion? Are they synonyms? Do ethics cover an even more diverse field of subtopics? That is a really good question. I've actually never really heard of them being synonymous, but I think that ethics is a huge part of, well, no, you're talking about in terms of sustainability, not in terms of cultural heritage. I think, you know, it's in the same way that climate change relates to sustainability. It's one component of this kind of large web. You know, if you're looking at ethics from the perspective of cultural heritage, you know, it applies to everything. It applies, it's in our ethical narrative, it's on our moral compass to be more sustainable, to, you know, reduce our carbon footprint, to be more diverse, like all of these topics. I mean, sustainability and ethics in some ways is almost synonymous. So I think that's a really interesting point. I'm going to delve a little bit more into detail on that topic later in our presentation, but actually I'd love to chat a little further about that at the end of the presentation if we have time. So thank you for asking. That's a great question. All right, cool. Are there any other questions before we charge on? Not at the moment? Okay, cool. Well, once again, if you guys have questions throughout the presentation, please do feel free to interrupt or to put them in the chat. Okay, everyone can see my slides again, I hope. Do interrupt me if you can't for some reason. Cool. All right. So as I mentioned, you know, there's this big web of sustainability, but I wanted to talk about kind of 3 specific topics in the second hour today. And I'm hoping that in the first hour, you guys feel that you got a sense of the framework of sustainability, both in terms of its application to the cultural sector, our opportunities and our impacts, as well as what the international frameworks are, and have a good idea of like, okay, what we're actually trying to do here is achieve a sustainable future. The SDGs are a roadmap for how to do that. The Paris Agreement is the scientific supported framework for policy on reducing and addressing climate change. So, and this is also how all of these things apply to the cultural sector. And most importantly, I can use these to get some funding. So hopefully that's a helpful framework for that. So if we're thinking really practically, and if you know me, you know that I'm a very practical person, I would like to take just a little bit of time here to delve into some of the particulars on sustainability. And these are 3 topics that I think are really important: circularity, carbon, and belonging. And I've mentioned belonging before, and I'd like to delve into that in terms of this overall sustainability social aspect. this is a series of 3 workshops, and in our next workshop, we're going to get into some of the more theoretical discussions. But I'm hoping that today we can really plant the seeds so that you guys feel that you have a really good understanding about not only the framework of sustainability, but some of the theory behind it, so that you can start, once again, having these glasses that you can put on and seeing how sustainability applies to different parts of your job and of your field. So we're going to start with circular economy. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that, when you're talking about sustainability, it can often feel like it's a compromise. And I want to make sure that we don't feel like that. Sustainability means, in my personal opinion, win-win-win. It should be something that is better for people, better for the planet, and better for our collections or an object. And I think that this is something really important. And I've mentioned this before, this is where our creative juices need to start getting flowing, because when we think of sustainability as compromise, we don't want to do it. But when we see sustainability as an opportunity, as an advancement, as an update or an upgrade, then it's exciting. So this is what we're aiming to do. We are looking for these win-win-win solutions that can better support our work as cultural professionals and the world's vision of a sustainable future. So we're going to start with this idea of waste and materials, because I think this is really a very strong entry point for us as cultural professionals, especially, of course, myself as an art conservator. I was dealing with materials a lot. And this is a really tangible way for us to see our impact. One of the things I want to do before we start talking about waste to materials is talk about how we should not be talking about waste. Waste isn't now a 4-letter word. It is not a word we should be using. And this was something that was pointed out to me by a colleague of mine from Moscow Circular in a presentation I was doing, because I kept talking about waste, and she was saying, if you call something waste, then you devalue it. And every single thing is still a material. Whether you have a use for it or not does not undermine its inherent physicality. The fact that it is a material. Just because you're done with this water bottle does not mean that it's no longer made of plastic. Just because you're finished with a banana peel doesn't mean that there aren't still biological nutrients in there. So what I'm calling waste, it's kind of that old adage, one man's trash is another man's treasure, is still a material. We're just devaluing it by calling it waste. So we're not going to use the term waste anymore. We're just going to use the term materials. All right, here's how we can think about materials. We talked about the idea of circular economy, and I'm really excited to hear that all of you have at least heard of circular economy. I want to talk very, very quickly about the theory of circular economy and then the LCAs, and then think about how we can apply this. So right now, the world that we are in is what's called a linear economy. This means that when we're producing materials, resources, anything, we extract resources from the planet, then we manufacture them into something, which of course has its own carbon footprint, then we consume it, and then we throw it away. In this system, products and materials are literally made, designed to be thrown away. We have things that are called disposable. Disposable nitrile gloves is an example of that. We have things that are called single use. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term single use plastic. This is a linear economy. This is a wasteful system. This is not regenerative, and it is not sustainable. This is how we get to the point where we have finite resources, because if we're not regenerating those resources, we can't keep extracting them and expecting that there will be more of them. This is what we're trying to move away from. What we're trying to move towards is circularity. Now, as I mentioned, when I first heard this term, I thought it was something for Wall Street. So I was excited to learn more about it. I hope that this will help you get an idea about circular economy as well. The reason in the question in the poll at the beginning, I said you're Ellen MacArthur, is because the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and they're the ones who produce this beautiful graphic. They are, and also these as well, they are the #1 authority in the world on circular economy. And I'm happy to, Google them, or I can share the link, but it's the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And they basically envision a world that is circular. So when we're talking about circularity, we're looking at two different processes. One is called the biological cycle, and one is called the technical cycle. The biological cycle is really easy. This is where you can think of regeneration of the earth. So an example of this in this model is a biological cotton t-shirt. So you plant the cotton, you grow the cotton, that's the plants part right here, and then you pick the cotton and make it into a t-shirt. That's the production part. Hopefully you have reusable energy, right? Then you have the product, it goes into use, and then when it's done being used, you can put it back into the biological cycle, meaning that you can biodegrade it. So you can put it back out into the earth, basically replant it, and the biological nutrients that are viable can go back into the earth and then regenerate and create more plants. And then those plants can be picked and produced and turned into a product and used and over again. This is an ideal world. This is very, very possible, very, very feasible. A lot of the clothes that I have come from this type of a situation. And that's not true, not a lot, but some of the clothes. But it's not the standard practice right now. A lot of times what we have an issue with is that the treatment of the cotton uses a lot of chemicals, toxic materials. We cross-pollinate cotton a lot with plastic. Actually, the cotton that you use, for example, with Q-tips, if you're a conservator, your cotton swabs, those are all cross-pollinated with plastic, which means that you cannot biodegrade it. It does not contain biological nutrients that can go to regenerating plants and then be part of this cycle. So we have to think about how we're producing things and how we're using things in order to make sure that they can stay in this circular economy cycle. Another example of this, donut economics, absolutely, Shadi, thank you. Another example of this is an aluminum can, and this is something called a technical cycle. So the technical cycle, basically you extract the technical nutrients, in this case, the aluminum. It goes into production, you create a product, you use it, and then you put it back into the system. So instead of having to extract more resources from plants or mining, in this case, you're actually recycling it or repurposing it or reusing it. And then it can continue to stay in the cycle. So the idea behind circular economy is that things can be continuously used, either in terms of creating new opportunities for use, like new growth, like the cotton, or recycled, repurposed, like the aluminum can. This is basically the complicated framework for all of the different aspects of circular economy. I like to break it down into the 5 R's. This for me is the easiest way. Now, if you Google the R's, you may be familiar with this little symbol down here at the bottom, recycle, and you may have seen that says like refuse, reduce, recycle. There are 3 R's, there are 5 R's, there are 9 R's. I've seen up to like 21 R's. There are a lot of R's. For me, 5 is enough to remember, so I always like to think about this. First thing you're going to do is refuse. Now, one of the things that's important to remember about the 5 R's, and Shadi, I will come back to your comment about donut economics in just a minute. One of the things that's important to remember about the 5 R's is that they go in order. You cannot start with recycle. Recycling is a last resort. You start at the top with refuse. Refuse is you do not buy something, or you do not buy something that comes from an unethical or unsustainable resource. So it's about your choices. Do you have to use something? If so, then where are you buying it from, or where are you obtaining it from? Is it circular? The second part is reduce. So obviously, if you use less of something, there's less opportunity for waste or for for extraction of more resources. So examples of this I always use once again as an art conservator is if I'm mixing a glue in my lab and I want to cover it with cling film, the stretchy plastic stuff. first question I ask is, do I really need to use this? And no, I probably don't really need to use it. What is the purpose of it? So I refuse to use it. But if I do say, no, actually, I really do need to use this, then I can think about how much I need to use. Do I need to wrap that thing 5 times, or is once enough? So reducing is number 2. Third step is reusing. Now, when you're reusing things, that's a great question, Evangelica. I will come to that in just a second. If you're reusing something, you're using something again in the same context as it was originally intended to be used. So here I like to talk about gloves. Once again, my conservator hat on. We're talking about disposable nitrile gloves. They are intended to be thrown away. But if we're talking about gloves, we can also use reusable gloves. You can use gloves that were designed to be reused over and over and over again. That's wonderful. That's reuse. Repurpose is the next part of this. If you're repurposing something, you're finding a new use for it. So if we're talking about that disposable nitrile glove, maybe you've reused it as many times as you can, and now it's covered in glue and pigments, and you can't touch an object with it because you'll destroy it. So let's see if we can find something else with it. Can you flip it inside out, fill it with sand, and use it as a weight? Can you take it home with you and use it for household cleaning? My personal thing that I like to do is I like to take my gloves to the beach and do beach cleanups. You can also do that in the forest or on the street or wherever, but you can use it to pick up trash. And isn't that a nice way to repurpose your gloves? The last resort is recycling. There is a fantastic, oh, sorry, was there a question? No? Okay. The last resort is recycling. There is a fantastic video by John Oliver. I'll share that in the chat later, about plastics. And he talks about why recycling is the last option. Basically, the very long and short of it is that recycling in most cases is not viable. The only things that can really be infinitely recycled are glass and aluminum. And you have to think about how the recycling process works. You have to transport it somewhere. It's very energy intensive. You have to reproduce it, and then you have to transport it again. So there's a whole carbon footprint to that. Plastics in 2018, 9% of plastics globally were recycled. Last year, that dropped to 5%. Most of our plastics end up either in incinerators or in the ocean. It is not economically viable to recycle plastic, which is why it's not something that plastic producing companies like Coca-Cola want to do, because it's actually cheaper to make virgin plastic. And also, plastic can only be recycled once, because when you recycle plastic, you break down the polymer chains and it loses its inherently nice properties. So if you take a water bottle, you cannot recycle it into a plastic water bottle. What you're actually doing is called downcycling. You are taking a material and making it into something that has less value. So you can recycle a plastic water bottle into some construction material or to asphalt for the street, but you can't recycle it into another plastic water bottle, because when you break down the polymers, it becomes less transparent, it becomes more brittle, and it can't be used as a water bottle again. So this is where recycling gets really misleading. Okay, we're having good conversations in here. Fantastic. All right. So I really, really quickly want to talk about life cycle assessment, and then I'll get to the questions about donut economics and growth. Those are very, very good questions. One of the ways that we can measure this whole carbon footprint of our materials is through life cycle assessment. So we're talking about circular economy. We want to keep everything in there, but we're talking about things like recycling and manufacturing. How does all of this come into play? What is the carbon footprint of this glass? This goes back to my conversation with my colleague about whether or not it's more sustainable to use the paper cup or the glass cup, because what are all these other considerations that need to come into play? This is what life cycle assessment does. It measures all of these aspects. It measures the entire impact of a material's life. Basically, it'll take into account the extraction. So what is the carbon footprint of mining or growing cotton, transportation, manufacture, use, as well as what happens to it afterwards or end of life. A lot of time when we're looking at materials, we're only thinking about how we're using it. we're not thinking about where it comes from or where it's going to go. This is what LCA does. It gives us a carbon footprint for the entire life cycle of a material. There is a very cool LCA calculator for cultural heritage called Stitch. Once again, happy to share all of these links and the presentation as well. It's a work in progress, so there's a lot of things that are on there. There's a lot of things that are being added, but it's a great way to start looking at, comparing ethifoam to polyester, for example. So it's a great way that you can actually start making some good informed decisions based on the environmental impact of a material. Okay, before we jump into carbon, let's talk very quickly about donut economics and about growth. I could not agree with you more about this idea of growth because, and this is actually one of the reasons that I find the SDGs to be outdated, is because the SDGs are talking about development and they're talking about growth. I think it's really important for us to think about slowing down. It is not sustainable to keep growing at the way that we're growing. And we can think about this in all types of contexts. We can think about this in terms of digital consumption, for example. If we're just constantly consuming, like, let's take emails. We're going to talk about emails in a little bit. We have an inbox and it collects emails, and we probably don't go through those emails and delete them. And so maybe a year ago you had 3,000 emails, and maybe this year you have 7,000 emails, and you delete them every once in a while, but they're just living in the cloud and it's fine and it's not a big deal. But actually, if we look at that extreme existential growth, or exponential growth, I should say, that has a carbon footprint to it. And one of the things that we're going to learn is that when we're looking at energy, when we're looking at materials, it's always about reducing first. That goes back to these 5 R's. Refuse, reduce, and then we can go into circular economy. So there's a whole concept called degrowth, which is really fascinating. And that scares a lot of people, but it's this idea about doing everything that we have with what we already have. And in my mind, that's regeneration, that's sustainability. I think that we have to stop thinking about development and growth as the metrics of success and actually start thinking about impact as a metrics of success instead. And donut economics is a really, really interesting concept about how we basically can work within this paradigm. So how do we apply the SDGs to our sustainability, or to our basically to our everyday work? And I had the pleasure of meeting Kate Rotworth in London last month, and we were chatting about how this applies to the cultural sector. And it's a really easy framework. Basically, the idea behind donut economics, and I'm sorry it's not in this presentation, but you can Google it, and once again, we can drop links in. But basically, the idea is that we want to be living within this donut. And in the middle of the donut hole, are the different metrics of social sustainability. And then outside of the donut are the different metrics of environmental sustainability. And basically, you can measure and evaluate the different components based on the SDGs. And what you want to be doing is living within that beautiful little middle ground that is the balance between environmental, social, economic. That is the balance zone. And then the inside, if you're getting inside, then you're doing poorly in one of the social aspects. And if you're getting outside of the donut, then you're doing poorly in one of the environmental aspects. So donut economics is a framework for looking basically at how we're doing. And I think I love Kate's approach to this. I think that in the cultural sector, we also actually have to start incorporating the economic component in there. So she and I are chatting about that, but a really, really interesting way to apply the framework of the SDGs to activities and to kind of a systemic view of the sector. So thank you so much for sharing that, Shadi. It's really, really important. Cool. Okay. Oh goodness. I told you guys I could talk a lot, so please do feel free once again. Yes, absolutely. Planetary boundaries. Thank you. And I'm sure even Angelica, you could probably come up here and teach more about donut economics than I can. So I wanted to talk a little bit about carbon and about energy, and then we're going to get into some of the ethical aspects here with the social components. When we're talking about carbon, we have to ask ourselves, what is carbon? Carbon is the building blocks of life. It's not the enemy. The fact that we are producing too much of it is the problem. Now, when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, carbon is one part of that, but GHGs account a lot of other type of vapors, I guess you could say. There's water vapor, which comes from rain and oceans. There's carbon dioxide, which comes from burning of fossil fuels. We've got methane, which comes from agriculture and cows, livestock. We have nitrous oxide, which comes from farming. And we have ozone, which can come from anything, including nitrous dioxide, but also photocopy machines produce ozone. Who knew? Another reason to turn those things off. Who uses them anymore anyway? So these are all of the different components of greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change, or the climate crisis, is caused by an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, methane is probably the most dangerous greenhouse gas emission, but carbon dioxide is the most impactful one right now. And it's also the easiest one to fix because burning of fossil fuels is something we do not need to be doing anymore. Methane is also easy. If we stop eating cows every day, then we don't need so many cows. And that's where a lot of methane comes from, is cow farts. And that's just a fact. When we're looking at carbon, though, specifically, because this is what we're going to be talking about right now, not all carbon emissions come from energy, and not all energy produces carbon. This is where clean or green energy comes into play. But since the Industrial Revolution, there has been a 40% increase in atmospheric concentrations of carbon emissions. And the primary source of this comes from the burning of fossil fuels. 27% of global carbon emissions come from electricity. So when we're talking about easy wins, when we're talking about where we can have the biggest impact, this is why this is such an important conversation, because the massive consumption of electricity is the number one contributor right now. These are some really handy little graphs, some very scary little graphs. This one over here on the right shows the projections of temperature change and basically where we are and where we're potentially going to be going. So if we're looking at where we are, well, we're 2023, can't remember what year it is. So this is what we're seeing right now. And this is really interesting because all of those lines kind of look right in there. But if we're on the trajectory that we are, if we keep on the trajectory that we're currently on, so don't stop consuming, continue to grow and expand in the way that we're already doing, we're going to go up to over 4 degrees, almost 4.5 degrees of climate warming. If we slow down according to current regulations, we'll go to a little bit above 3. If we have our carbon emissions in the next 7 years, we're on a trajectory that we can stay below 2. So there is still hope. We can still do it. But look at that pivotal point we're at right now. I mean, if we look at this graph, it's the next 7 years that's going to determine which trajectory we're on. So this is why we have to change today. I don't need to preach to you guys about this. You already know this. What's really exciting is we can start looking at what solutions we can implement. Now, I wanted to just give a little overview of energy and carbon. A lot of times when you start talking about energy, people throw things at you like EUI and KWH and KBTUs, and it can get a little overwhelming. Basically, just very unjargoning this, EUI is energy intensity or energy use intensity. That is how much energy is being used. That's usually measured in per square meter or foot per year. So if you see an EUI and it's saying something, that's basically how much energy is being used. Kilowatt hours and KBTUs are units that are measuring either heat or electrical energy. Most of your bills are in kilowatt hours, but all of this can be contextualized using this really handy tool, the GHG emissions calculator. I showed you a little earlier what that can do. So that can give us a context in terms of energy to converting energy to carbon, also converting carbon into contexts. So I always recommend that instead of trying to learn all of the mechanics behind it, use tools that have been developed to make these things a little bit easier to understand. All right. When we're talking about measuring carbon, carbon is typically reported in 3 different scopes. So when you're doing a carbon calculation, you're probably measuring scope 1, 2, and or 3 emissions. This is the schematic for measuring your carbon emissions. And we're going to talk all about this in just a second. Basically, scope 1 are your direct emissions. So those are things that you own and are responsible for. So that may be like if your museum has its own car, or your building is owned by the institution, then those are direct emissions. Scope 3 are indirect emissions, or I'm sorry, scope 2 are indirect emissions, but those are things that you purchase. So for example, so you still have control over them. So your electricity in most cases is probably going to be scope 2 because you purchase it from a utility company. Your business travel might be scope 2 because you're purchasing that ticket. Your waste might be scope 2 because you're paying to have it thrown away. Scope 3 emissions, unfortunately, are the most heavy ones. So those are the ones that actually are indirect and also out of your control in a lot of cases. And usually, especially for the cultural sector, the biggest impact. Because scope 3 emissions include audiences and their travel and transportation. Also includes things like investments and funds. So where our money comes from and where it's going, banks, fossil fuel companies, et cetera. So this is just to give you guys an idea about when you're talking about carbon emissions and you're measuring your carbon footprint, we also have to think about what are we measuring? Are we just measuring scope 1? Are we measuring scope 1 and scope 2? Are we measuring all 3 scopes? And how detailed do we actually need to get? I want to talk very quickly about, I already went into this. So these are your, just once again, your scope 1, 2, and 3 and where they come from. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the idea behind doing a carbon calculation and then some of the more appropriate, I think, language about this. But first, I promised I would tell you about net zero. Most of you said you did not know the difference between net zero energy and net zero carbon, and these are hugely important distinctions. Because a lot of companies right now, as we know, and even a lot of cultural institutions, museums, theaters, galleries, I know organizations all over the world that are making commitments to going net zero. What does that mean? There are 2 types of net zero. There are net zero energy, and then there's net zero carbon. Now, you may just think that that's either carbon or energy, but actually it's a little bit more complicated than that. Net zero energy means that all energy consumed by the building is produced on site. This is what you might think net zero actually means because there's no carbon being produced by this institution. This is very complicated. For a lot of institutions, especially like if you're a museum in a city and you can't put solar panels on your roof, we'll get there, of course, but basically the idea behind net zero energy is that's kind of the end goal. You're self-sufficient, you're off the grid. Net zero carbon is actually what most people are talking about when they're talking about net zero, because net zero carbon is very easy to achieve if you have money in the current regulations. Net zero carbon allows for external uses of renewable energy sources, which is great. No one's mad about that. Buy all the green energy you want. That's fantastic. The problem with net zero carbon is that it also allows for compensating unavoidable emissions. So if you are net zero, that does not mean that you are not producing carbon. What it does mean is that you are offsetting the carbon that you do produce. This is where we get into a lot of trouble. Because if a company says that they're going net zero and they mean they're going net zero carbon, that means that they can just do a carbon calculation and say, okay, well, the social cost of carbon today is this amount. And so I am going to plug that into my calculation, and I will pay 1.3 million euro, and I will offset my carbon. And then I could just go on as business as usual. I don't have to actually make any changes. I don't have to cut my emissions at all. I don't have to do anything to reduce. I can just offset and call it a day. And wouldn't that be nice? But we know now that actually going net zero is not the solution. What we need to do, and actually really the only true way for net zero to be effective is if we're reducing our carbon by 90% and then 10% offset, that's fine. But the more achievable goal, the more realistic goal, and the most important goal is we want to focus on halving our emissions by 2030. So this means that making a commitment to net zero is a little outdated. What we need to be committing to is we are committing to halving our emissions, reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030. This is all of the scientific. So once again, we have basically a communication issue, because when people talk about net zero, they usually think that you're talking about net zero energy when we're actually talking about net zero carbon. And net zero carbon does not mean a reduction of carbon emissions necessarily. And I'm going to talk in just a second about why these offsets are really not a good idea. And mostly, actually, I'm going to talk about that right now. Mostly it's because they're not really effective and they don't have long-term strategies. So what we want to talk about actually, and let's see, I'm not sure if I go into this in a little bit more detail, so I'll just mention this now. Basically, the reason that offsets are not always effective or long-term is that they tend to be cop-outs. Offsetting projects, unless they are, oh, sorry, can you guys hear me? It says my internet connection's unstable. I hope you can still hear me. Ping me if you can't. One of the reasons that carbon offsets are not effective is because a lot of times the programs that the money are going into don't have long-term thinking, or they were already, thank you, Rania, or they were already going to happen. There's a really funny example. Once again, John Oliver does an amazing expose on carbon offsets and why they the answer. And one of the examples he gives is a carbon offsetting program to save a forest in the United States. And it turns out that that forest is on private property and was never actually under threat to be removed. So the offsetting is just basically going towards a multi-billionaire who can keep the forest as his personal hunting ground. But that's that's like a carbon offset program. And so there was a company that put all of its money into carbon offsetting to help this multi-billionaire maintain his private land, which was never under threat. That's why it's not effective, is because that is not going to have an impact on reducing our carbon emissions in the next 7 years. One of the other problems, you see a lot of companies that donate to tree planting organizations. So, we're going to offset by donating to this wonderful company in Indonesia who is going to, plant a bunch of trees. Isn't that great? Well, first of all of the forests that were cut down in Indonesia to make place for palm oil is part of the huge problem. But the other problem is that the trees that are being planted would take 10 years to actually sequester the amount of carbon that they're being planted to sequester. And most of those trees are cut down in 3 to 4 years. So the problem we're having right now is that these offsetting schemes are not actually, because I was livid when I heard about this. And so we really need to make sure that we are not thinking about going net zero by relying on carbon offsets. And actually what we're looking at doing, my colleagues and I have been working on, and we'll have more information about at the end of May, is this idea of, instead of saying we're going carbon neutral or we're going net zero, we're going carbon conscious. Because once again, we're skipping a step. If we're talking about going carbon neutral, we are talking about measuring our emissions and then offsetting our emissions. But what we need to be focusing on, actually, most of our time and energy is that middle ground, which is reducing. It is important to measure your emissions. It is important because then you know where you can make the biggest impact. And it is important because we need to be transparent about it. How are we as the cultural sector supposed to maintain our sense of trust and our responsibility to our audiences if we're not being honest? So measuring is about being transparent, and it's about understanding where we can get started. But do not spend all of your time measuring. I have to say, I always tell people, when you're talking about doing a carbon calculation, that is a wormhole that you can get lost in for years, because you can measure down to every single pen, every single piece of paper. It can get really, really complicated really quickly. I always say, go simple and ballpark it. It is absolutely fantastic and really useful to look at what other similar organizations have in terms of their carbon footprint and say, well, if this museum is about this and we have a similar size space and we have a similar kind of collection and rules and location, then we're probably in that range. Or you can measure, your building and then just say, okay, our building has, this amount of carbon and this amount is coming from lighting and this amount is coming from climate control. We know that those two things need to be reduced. So we're going to focus on that first. So it's just to get some idea. Absolutely, Shadi, I agree. Offsetting is a distraction. I mean, it's a cop out. And I think that actually what's interesting is that I think carbon calculations have the danger of that too, because a lot of times companies right now, especially right now, are measuring their carbon footprint. Fantastic. But that is not the end goal. We are not here to measure our carbon footprints and then say, look at us, we measured our carbon footprint. We're so sustainable. We can be done with it now. Because that doesn't change anything. What we actually have to focus on is this middle part, reducing our emissions, because that is what is going to get us to the under 2 degrees Celsius. That is going to help us fulfill the goals of reducing climate control. And that is what's going to make this planet sustainable for us to live on. And then, of course, we know that it is not always possible to reduce all of your carbon emissions. And so, even if you're making that wonderful commitment to halve your emissions by 2030, there's still that other 50%. And what can you do there? Well, you can invest in something called strategic climate funds. So if you do have money to invest in projects, strategic climate funds are not offsets. They are climate funds that have been verified to have the appropriate amount of impact in the next 7 years. A great example of a strategic climate fund, and the one that we work with, is Art to Acres. That is a nonprofit organization that raises money to buy at-risk land in developing or at-risk land in South America primarily, and Central America. And then it's donated back to indigenous organizations or local landowners. So basically, the reason that that's really impactful is that if there is a piece of land that is being is going to be developed for agriculture, turned into farming, they buy that land, maintain the natural biodiversity, maintain all of the carbon sinks that are in there, which is the things that suck up the carbon, which is what we need. And then that carbon is not released, and that piece of land can absorb more carbon. So that is an impactful way to do it. But what I actually like to do, because in the cultural sector, we don't usually have the money to throw at these types of things. Obviously, if you're like a private gallery, that's one thing, but as a museum, you probably don't. So what I like to encourage us to do is actually in what I call insetting. Take the money that you would have to pay to offset your carbon and invest it in yourself. Invest it in reducing your own emissions. If you calculate your carbon footprint and you say, okay, well, we would have to pay $50,000 to offset these emissions, take that money and upgrade your HVAC system. Take that money and use it to buy an electric vehicle to replace your current vehicle. Find ways that you can actually take that money and invest it to reduce the carbon emissions that you're producing in the first place. This is how we're going to get there. All right. Oh, goodness. I know I always talk too much. Okay. we're going to very, very quickly go through the last part of this, and then I want to spend the last 15 minutes talking about social aspects. So this is just an example of a way that you can talk about being carbon conscious. So you're committed to knowing, acting, and contributing positively. Once again, all of this will be available to you guys if you want to check that out. Okay, I did talk about carbon offsets a little bit, so we don't need to go into that in too many details. And I already talked about how you can actually do quote unquote offsetting, or rather insetting, in a more reputable and effective way. All right, fantastic. Good question, Helen. Gallery Climate Coalition has a really fantastic website that has strategic climate funds. On there that have been verified, and they've been multi-party verified. So that is the resource that I always like to give people. They've been verified not only by third parties, but also by climate scientists. So I would go to Gallery Climate Coalition, I was trying to highlight that, or the GCC, and they have a whole section on strategic climate funds and talk about also very transparently how those are verified. I know the UN also has some really great verified organizations on their website. And if you check out the key books, the key book on energy, we also have a list in there. So there are ways that we can do this. We just have to, once again, be conscientious about it. Okay, I'm not going to go too much into benchmarking and baselines because we don't have time for it. Basically, as I was talking about earlier, if you're talking about measurements, benchmarking is really helpful because you can see what other people with similar situations are doing. Basically, if you're calculating your carbon emissions, you need to be transparent about it so that people can also use that information and they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So if you're an organization and you're going to calculate your carbon footprint, then let other organizations know what your carbon footprint is, so they can say, oh, well, your carbon footprint is this and our carbon footprint is this. Clearly, we need to make some improvements in this area, and you might be able to learn from us in other areas. So benchmarking is basically comparing like to like. So it's looking at how we can learn from each other as a sector. And this is something we're really, really, really far behind in as a sector. We're about 20 years behind other sectors. But it's really important for us to be able to be transparent about if we are doing carbon calculations to streamline the process and get moving. Okay, once again, sorry that was so quick, but I do have some stuff I want to talk to that I think is more important. Oh God, I really have no time to go into this. Energy, I'm going to go through one point per slide, so bear with me here. Measuring energy, buildings are probably the number one component. As I mentioned earlier, the most important thing that we can do is start by reducing our consumption. It makes absolutely no sense for us to just try and switch over to 100% renewables, because at the rate that we're consuming, we will never be able to keep up with the demand through any sort of supply. So we have to start by reducing. Easy to do. As I mentioned, climate control. If you work at a museum, update your climate control conditions. You do not need plus or minus 5. You don't need even plus or minus 10. It can be better than that. Green labs. Unplug equipment when it's not in use. Look at your energy consumption in your lab. If you have one, let me know and I can give you all kinds of things. I mentioned unplugging electricity or electronics. There's this thing called phantom energy, where basically most appliances continue to consume electricity, even if they are off, if they're still plugged in. Your computer is a great example of that. If you have your laptop plugged in and it's fully charged, and then you turn it off, it's going to continue to consume energy, even if it's off. And you can see it with that green light being on. Really easy ways to do this to reduce phantom energy is unplugging when not in use. Using meter monitors, which are these great little things you put in the outlet, then you put the equipment in there and it tells you how much energy is being consumed. So you can see how much energy is being consumed when you are using an appliance, and then also how much when it's off. So that's a really great way also to be able to measure what you're doing and celebrate your success and say like, oh, by unplugging this, I'm saving X amount of energy. Isn't that nice? Also know that power save mode is not off, especially relevant if you have a desktop computer. Data centers, are estimated to consume 1/5 of the world's energy in 3 years, or 2 years actually now. Once again, this is about supply. It's about demand. We are consuming internet stuff. You're streaming of your TV shows on Netflix, you're streaming of your music, the massive amount of emails that we have going back and forth, all of our Zoom calls. Our internet footprint is currently responsible for 2% of global emissions, which is the same as the airline industry pre-COVID. So this is a really, really easy way for us to actually start reducing, is delete old emails, unsubscribe from newsletters, download your music or your TV shows and then watch them rather than stream them. If you're listening to music, use Spotify instead of YouTube. The extra video clip is really consuming. Stop sending PDFs, send links instead. We do that. It's been fantastic. Really easy ways for us to take personal accountability. I know that when I found out about emails, the thing at the bottom of an email that says think before you print has a bigger carbon footprint than printing the email. When I found out about this, I had like 20,000 emails in my inbox. It's absolutely shocking. Okay, we're not going to go into too much detail about energy reduction because unfortunately we just don't have time. But basically, simple steps are the way to start. All right, I wanted to talk about belonging. We've got 8 minutes here. I'll try to get this in. I do have to say I have to stop sharing my screen for just a second because I forgot to, oh God, there we go. Share my sound, and I have a little video clip that I want to share as well. There we go. Okay, back to the slideshow. All right. I said that I didn't really like the word inclusion, and I think, and we're going to explore a little bit why, but I wanted to just go into a couple of the issues about social sustainability. Nelson, I saw your comment. Thank you. Email me. Let's talk about it. I know that it's not that easy, but it's also not that complicated. When we're talking about social sustainability, one of the things that's really important is this idea of belonging. And in my mind, that's co-creation and that's creating ownership. It is important for everyone to feel that they have a say in the process, in the workspace, and really looking at how we treat each other. If we're talking about social sustainability, we're just talking about people relationships. And that is reflected in everything that we do. So I talked about inclusion. I'm going to start with talking about why I like the word belonging better. This is the definition of inclusion. It's giving everyone equal opportunity. It's involving every member, irrespective of their background or any other characteristics. But Dr. John Powell talks about why belonging is a better word. And I'm going to share this. Please give me a thumbs up if you can hear. And hopefully this should be linked. Yeah, it's at the right spot.
So you have exclusion, which is obviously an extreme form of othering. And then you have inclusion. And sometimes people think of inclusion in the same way the people who invited James Baldwin in. That is, you can come in, but this is my house, this is my party, so behave yourself. You're a guest. Whether it's coming into Berkeley or whether it's coming into a hospital, the rules, the norms, the expectations are already set. And so what's the thing that you're joining? The thing that you're joining, the institution, the structure, the culture, oftentimes have profound biases already in place. And you're asked to come in and join and be quiet. Don't bring the riffraff with you. So I am the riffraff. So belonging is not simply joining something. Belonging is about co-creating the thing you're joining. And in order to co-create, you need power. So it's not your house or my house. It's not your city or my city. It's our city. We co-create it. We make it together with all of our complexities and dreams. And that's a very different process. So we haven't decided our new name yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if belonging.
Okay. So I think that Dr. Powell really explains this in the most eloquent way, because when we're talking about inclusion, it is indeed what we're kind of doing in the museum world, at least. It's like, come into our museum, everyone, we want you here, please come in. But we have the narratives, we have the power over what you see, we have the power over what you read, we have the power over what you experience. Whereas belonging is this next step. It's this idea of bringing people in, inviting them in, and co-creating something. What if you went out to a community, your local community, and said, what kind of exhibition do you want to see? Do you want to like come in with us and pick out the artworks that are going to go into this? This is the next step in this idea of the cultural heritage. This is a phenomenal presentation, by the way. It's about 45 minutes in total. Highly recommend you watch it. I just love that. I think it's so so spot on. Okay.
So you have exclusion.
Hold on. There we go. There we go. Okay, so we only have a couple minutes left here. Once again, I'm so sorry. I promised you I could talk a lot. I wanted to just talk very, very quickly about decolonization, because this is a term that's been used a lot lately. And a lot of times when people think of decolonization, they think of colonial settlers and colonized peoples. But it does go beyond that, because it's about equality, it's about power, and it's about narratives. When we're talking about decolonization, it's really about telling history from everyone's perspective. It's about being human-centric. And it's about breaking down these social structures that we have, that have been in place, that are requirements. It's about putting the person first. So a really clear example of this, and probably a lot of us have heard about decolonization in the context of museums. So we need to include Indigenous voices. We need to include voices from communities that were previously enslaved. We need to, think about where our collections came from, and think about how we can talk about war and violence in relation to our collections. This is a really, really tangible way for us to get involved with decolonization. But it's more than that. It's not just about, saying that we have to look at our collections, but it's also about how we treat each other, and treating each other and looking at each other as human beings and not a cog in a larger society, and treating each other as individuals and treating our objects as individuals. So decolonization, we're going to get much more into that, I think, in the next workshop. This is something that I'd love to unpack. And I would also love to unpack the ethics question as well in our next workshop. So really, really interesting topic that applies to everyone. It doesn't just apply to settlers and colonized nations. It applies to literally everyone in every context. Okay, so we have 2 minutes left here. We're going to talk about accessibility very quickly. I did put this in the context of digital. And I think what's really important for us to think about accessibility is that when it comes to being a cultural professional, oftentimes we can feel very fancy. And I'm totally guilty of this. But by being fancy, we're not necessarily being accessible. So we have to think about who has access to our spaces. Is it just people with computers? Is it only people who are wealthy enough to have an internet connection? Is it only people who have been trained in using laptops and the internet? So accessibility is not just about putting things out there. It's also about help supporting people having that interaction with it. And of course, this also relates to our collections. I mean, how inaccessible 90% of our collections are sitting in storage. And when we're talking about accessibility, one of the other things that's really important to talk about here is how we communicate. And I always talk about this really great guide called Words Matter. And it's important for us to realize that what language we're using and how we're using it and what words we're using. And I think, you know, a lot of words can be heavily politicized in different places. I mean, you talk about climate change and half of the United States starts screaming at you. But if you start talking about taking care of nature, or if you start talking about taking care of people, then actually I think we're all on the same page. It's just about how we communicate with each other and how we talk to each other and how we create safe spaces for being listened to, being heard. Because half the time people are angry because they just don't feel heard. So make a point of not only paying attention to what you're saying, but paying attention to what you're hearing and how you're listening. Okay, I'm going to finish up here with this topic of equity and equality. And I know we're over time, so if you do have to go, I apologize for being over, but please do. I think you can check the recording back. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll just hang out for a couple more minutes, and I promise I'll let everyone go. So really fast, equality means that everyone is equal. Everyone is given the same resources or opportunities. However, we know that equity is a way to recognize that that is not the truth. That is not the current situation. We are not in a utopia where everyone is equal. Just because we're created equal doesn't mean we're treated equally. So equity understands this and basically uses a different type of distribution of resources and opportunities in order to enable people to reach an equal outcome. A really easy example of equity is basically when you're trying to, actually, I'm sorry, we'll look at this here. So the difference between equity and equality. If we're looking at the picture on the left side, that's equality. Everyone has the same, is given the same thing. However, if we're looking at being equitable, we can see that one person is taller and one person is shorter and one person can't see without the box. So we redistribute the resources to make sure that everyone has an equal view by giving them equitable resources. All right, I'm going to wrap up here by asking you guys to ask yourselves four simple questions. Anytime we start thinking about sustainability, we have to think about what we're doing, but we also think about how we're doing this, why we're doing this, and most importantly, who we're doing this for. So if we go back to the beginning today, we're talking about being sustainable in the cultural sector. And I was saying that the reason I was having a hard time practicing as an art conservator is because I understood what I was doing, but the how, the why, and the who were unclear to me. Because the way that I was doing what I was doing was not sustainable. And consequently, it needed to be reevaluated. All right. I have a bunch of tools and resources here. I will be very, very happy to share those with all of you. I know we're a little over time. Didn't have too much time for discussion, but in the next workshop, that's all we're going to be doing. So I'm hoping that you leave today feeling a sense of empowerment, a sense of understanding, and also maybe some excitement about delving into these topics a little bit deeper. Thank you guys so much for joining. I do apologize again for going over time a little bit, but really, really grateful to you all for your patience, for your interest, and also for being a part of our workshop today. And I look forward to seeing you at the next one. So thank you again, everyone. Looking forward to talking soon.